Welcome to the Global News Podcast from the BBC. I'm Janat Jalil. And joining me from Washington is our State Department correspondent, Tom Bateman. And after weeks when President Trump kept promising that a peace deal with Iran was close, only for those hopes to be dashed, we finally have a deal that's been announced between the US and Iran. So, Tom, does this mean that the Strait of Hormuz will now fully reopen? Because President Trump hailed this deal with the words, "Let the oil flow."
Well, we don't know the answer to that, frankly, because I think what we're seeing here is certainly a lot of sort of celebration, really, from both the Americans and to some degree from the Iranians, that they are both suggesting that they've got things that they have demanded from this deal. But until we get the actual text published of this agreement, it's really hard to know for certain where it will lead, because both sides are really spinning this quite hard, to the extent that we're getting quite contradictory messages over it. Now, from what was being briefed by the administration here in Washington late last week, clearly the primary purpose of this agreement is to reopen the Strait of Hormuz in return for the Americans lifting their naval blockade. But I would say already we're seeing some discrepancies between the two sides over even what reopening the Strait of Hormuz actually means. I mean, President Trump has gone on social media to say the strait is now open, that ships are passing, but the Iranians have said that they will, or they intend to, impose what they're calling service charges for ships passing. The Americans will interpret that as tolls, which they have said are not part of this agreement. There will not be tolls imposed by the Iranians. So already that sticking point appears to be coming into friction as this agreement is being announced.
Right, and also you've got to clear the mines, and you've got to move those hundreds of ships that have been stuck there for weeks. So even if ships were allowed to start moving again immediately without any restrictions, it would take weeks, possibly months, for things to get back to normal when it comes to oil and liquefied natural gas supplies.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, the Iranians had said on Sunday that there would be a 30-day period, that it would take that time for the strait to reopen. And of course, there is this whole issue of demining that the Americans have referred to. When President Trump initially announced the deal, he said, as you said, the sort of proclamation, "I hereby announce the strait is open and let the ships start up their motors and the oil flow." Just an hour later, he sent another message saying that the strait would actually reopen on Friday, when the deal is due to be signed in Geneva. So clearly things are not clear on that front. This has been a highly militarized environment. There's a huge amount of American hardware in and around the area. Ships have been unable to pass basically because they can't get the insurance coverage because of the risk of Iranian drones or missile strikes. So clearly a lot to take place really before the shipping industry feels that necessary sense of security.
And Tom, the agreement's not due to be signed until Friday the 19th in Switzerland. A lot could change between now and then.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, actually, because although this is being pitched and sold by both sides as basically a sort of comprehensive deal to end the war, the Pakistani mediators, Shehbaz Sharif, the Prime Minister, has called this a peace deal. It's already clear that there is within this talks this week that are supposed to set up what they're calling technical talks that should take place from Friday, lasting a couple of months, about the implementation of this deal. So you've already got talks about talks, with the deal not being actually signed yet. And already I think this sense of discrepancies, even about the most basic issues in terms of reopening the Strait of Hormuz and lifting the naval blockade. So there's clearly scope for things to go wrong. It does feel like there's momentum towards signing it on Friday. I think both sides are ready for that. But the question is then, and what we've seen on the ground and on the water, is we've had ceasefires. There was a ceasefire announced on April the 8th, and President Trump said then the Strait of Hormuz will now be opened. It wasn't. The Iranians have demanded sanctions relief, say that this will allow them access immediately to oil revenues. They say they're not going to enter into those 60 days of talks unless the Americans honor that and they get some of their money up front. The Americans are denying that's the case. So we just don't know. And, clearly there is, as I say, again, so much discrepancy about the way this agreement's being characterized. Until we get to see the actual published text, I think it's really hard to know definitively where this agreement has landed. But clearly there is scope already, I think, for things to start to go wrong with it.
If Iran succeeds in its aim of getting international sanctions lifted or some kind of relief on those sanctions, and if it succeeds in its aims of getting its billions of dollars frozen in bank accounts abroad released, then what people will be saying, what was the point of this war? It's actually not even gone back to the status quo. It's worse than it was before in terms of the Iranian regime's influence and strength.
Well, I mean, the overarching aim for President Trump has been, he has said, to deny Iran the ability ever to develop or acquire a nuclear weapon. Now, when the war was announced, he went much further than that. He effectively said and called for regime change, a collapse of the entire current governance structures that have been in place since the Islamic Revolution in 1979, and to basically get a sort of pliant US-friendly administration in Tehran that would do what the US administration wanted. Fundamentally, I think if you look at the way this began, I don't think the Americans were entirely in control of the timing of this. Clearly, although they deny this, there had been some element of persuasion by the Israelis, who killed the supreme leader on day one. What seems to be in this deal broadly is a set of commitments or broad understandings from either side about both Iran committing not to develop a nuclear weapon or to acquire one. But it has always said that. The issue has been around how you get a program in place to make that happen and, crucially, to verify it. Now, that is what the Obama administration tried to do in the deal that was signed 2015, 2016. President Trump violated the terms of that when he was during his first term, effectively withdrew the US from it, reapplied sanctions onto the Iranians, even though the inspectors said the Iranians were in compliance. And so that is why the administration is saying that the application of force, bombing the Iranians, has forced them has given the Americans the leverage they want to ensure that they get a stronger deal this time round. But what officials who worked under the Obama administration, and notably Rob Malley, who was the lead negotiator for the 2015 nuclear deal, their argument is that the Trump administration is now in a worse position than it was before they started this war, because what Iran has shown is it can resist this, full force by the Americans and the Israelis. It's still intact, although very much eroded conventionally, but it's shown that it can effectively hold the global economy to ransom. That creates huge leverage, and so there is a big argument and actually a concern among many Republicans that President Trump is going to end up with potentially an even weaker deal than the 2015 one. Now, the administration completely rejects that and says this will be a tougher and stronger deal. I think a big test will be in the measure of how long President Trump says that they can prohibit, and verifiably so, Iran from enriching uranium, nuclear material, to potentially weapons-grade material. The Obama deal basically stopped that for 10 to 15 years. President Trump has said he could live with a 20-year prohibition. Is he going to get anything like that? Well, already he's sort of rowing back a bit on that as being an objective here.
And Tom, as you say, a lot of people say that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was a big instigator of this war. It was a war that was jointly launched by the US and Israel. And now critics of Mr. Netanyahu are saying that Israel is a big loser from this war because Mr. Netanyahu has failed to achieve his aims of changing the Iranian regime, destroying Hezbollah in Lebanon. And this is not going to help his hopes of being re-elected later this year.
Yes, absolutely. Critics, not least Mr. Netanyahu's political opponents in Israel, who, we're recording this on the Monday morning, been waking up today to news of this proposed deal, or this deal by the Americans and the Iranians and are absolutely excoriating Mr. Netanyahu, saying that this is an utter failure. They believe it risks Israel's security because it's effectively the worst combination of things for some of the critics of this deal, particularly in Israel, who believe that the war, who will point out the war has failed to dislodge the Iranian regime, but at the same time created leverage in a deal where they are arguably putting more pressure on Mr. Trump than was the case in the first place. And therefore, Mr. Netanyahu's opponents are saying that this is a failure. Now, that is important really for two reasons. One is that you have in Lebanon Hezbollah as an armed and funded ally of the Iranian regime that effectively acts as a deterrent force for the Israelis attacking Iran. That war, there's no clear sign that war is coming to an end, even though the Iranians and the Pakistani mediators have said that will be included in this ceasefire. I think it's clearly going to be the case, and the Israelis are already demanding that they have, as in the language they put it, the right to defend themselves against a Hezbollah threat. Now, they have interpreted that as basically being a sort of one-sided ceasefire where Hezbollah does not fire on the Israelis, but Israel, continues its occupation of southern Lebanon and has continued, even though a ceasefire has been agreed with Lebanon, to attack Hezbollah. It says because Hezbollah has been planning or has fired into northern Israel. The other big issue politically for Mr. Netanyahu is he's facing re-election at the end of this year. Now, as most Israelis have supported the war with Iran, as that war has looked, when it has looked as though it's achieving some of the Israeli objectives, that has helped Mr. Netanyahu's support. But I think this is really going to damage him in the polls in terms of going into that election probably in October this year.
Tom, thank you very much. And if you'd like to hear more from the Global News Podcast, please click on the link below.